I pressed my back against the concrete barrier and checked my watch for the third time in 10 minutes. 01:34 hours. The darkness beyond our perimeter stretched endlessly into the Afghan mountains, and somewhere out there in that black void, something was making noise again. Forward operating base. Shank sat like a metal scab on the landscape of Logar province. 12 soldiers crammed into prefab shelters and guard towers that felt more like targets than protection. We'd been here since September, and November had brought with it a cold that cut through our gear and something else that cut through our nerves. The sounds started about a month ago. At first, we wrote them off as wind through the rocky terrain or maybe distant wildlife. The mountains played tricks with acoustics. Everyone knew that. But wind didn't scream in what sounded like human voices, and no animal I'd ever heard could produce the low, whispered conversations that drifted across our position every night after sunset. Daniel moved beside me in the tower, his rifle gripped so tight I could see the white of his knuckles, even in the green glow of our night vision. The kid was 22, freckled face that made him look even younger, and he'd been jumpy as hell for weeks. Every shadow made him tense up. Every distant sound had him swinging his weapon toward empty desert. "You hear that?" he whispered, voice barely audible. I listened. The usual sounds of our base buzzed around us. Generators, radio chatter from the communications bunker, boots on metal walkways. Beyond that, the silence of the Afghan night pressed in from all sides. Then it came. A burst of laughter, high-pitched and sharp, cutting through the quiet like broken glass. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before fading back into nothing. "There," Daniel said, his breathing quick and shallow. "You heard it that time, right?" I nodded, though my gut twisted with the same sick feeling I'd been carrying for weeks. The laughter always sounded wrong, like someone trying to copy the sound without understanding what made it human. It came from different directions each night, sometimes close enough that it felt like the source was just outside our wire, other times so far away it might have been coming from the next valley over. "Could be locals," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "At 2 in the morning, out here?" Daniel had a point. Our position was 40 miles from the nearest village, surrounded by terrain that even the Taliban avoided during winter months. No reasonable person would be wandering these mountains after dark, especially not close enough to our base that we could hear their conversations. But we did hear them. Every night, the whispered voices started around midnight and continued until dawn. Different languages that none of us recognized, sometimes overlapping like multiple groups having separate discussions. The conversations never got loud enough for us to make out words, but the rhythm sounded purposeful, organized. Intel briefings never mentioned anything about local populations in this area. Command had chosen this location specifically because it was isolated, strategically positioned but unlikely to draw civilian attention. Yet something was out there, watching us, talking about us, laughing at us. I rubbed my eyes and tried to focus on the job. Night watch meant checking the perimeter, monitoring radio traffic, staying alert for actual threats, not jumping at every sound that might or might not be human voices carried on the wind. The problem was, I wasn't the only one hearing things. Kyle Anderson, our squad leader, had started requesting additional daytime patrols to investigate the source of the sounds. Every morning, teams went out to check the areas where we'd read voices the night before. They found nothing. No footprints, no camp signs, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. Just rocks and sand and the endless empty landscape that surrounded our position. Kyle was 32, career military with enough deployment experience to handle pretty much anything Afghanistan could throw at us. If he was concerned enough to order daily sweeps, that meant the situation was getting serious. He'd never admitted to being bothered by the sounds, but I'd seen how he positioned himself during evening briefings, always facing the door, always keeping one hand near his sidearm. James Rodriguez had started volunteering for every daytime change available, finding excuses to avoid night watches whenever possible. The kid was normally solid, disciplined and reliable, but something about the darkness had him spooked. He'd turned down meals if it meant staying inside after sunset, and I'd caught him checking the locks on supply bunkers that didn't even have locks. Daniel had developed a similar pattern, though he was less subtle about it. Last week, he'd actually requested reassignment to kitchen duty just to avoid drawing night patrol. Kyle had denied the request, but I could tell he understood the motivation. The whole unit was on edge. I moved my position and looked around the rocky outcropping to our northeast. During daylight, you could see for miles in every direction. Empty hills dotted with boulders, dry creek beds that hadn't seen water in months, scrub vegetation that somehow survived in this climate. At night, it all disappeared into black shapes and deeper shadows that moved when the wind picked up. "Movement," Daniel said suddenly, training his rifle on something I couldn't see. I followed his line of sight and turned on my thermal scope. The landscape appeared in changing patterns of green and black, heat signatures standing out against the cooler background. Nothing. No warm bodies, no vehicles, no signs of life beyond our own position. Where? 2 o'clock, maybe 200 meters. Something big moving behind those rocks. I adjusted my scope and searched the area. The boulders formed natural cover that could hide a person or small group, but my equipment showed only cold stone and empty ground. "I don't see anything." Daniel lowered his weapon but kept watching. It was there, human-sized, moving from left to right behind the ridge. Maybe he'd seen a wild animal. Goats sometimes wandered through this region, and the heat signatures could be confusing at distance. But Daniel had been out here long enough to recognize common wildlife, and he wouldn't have called it human-sized if he wasn't reasonably sure. The radio made noise with Kyle's voice from the command bunker. "Tower 2, status report." I pressed the mic. "Tower 2, all clear. Possible animal movement to the northeast, but no confirmed threats." "Copy that. Maintain watch and report any changes." "Roger." I clipped the radio back to my vest and checked my watch again. 3 more hours until dawn. 3 more hours of looking around empty terrain and jumping at sounds that might not even be real. The thing that bothered me most wasn't the sounds themselves, but how they seemed designed to get under our skin. The timing was too convenient, always starting after dark when visibility was limited. The locations were too strategic, coming from areas that forced us to split our attention between multiple possible approach routes. And the voices themselves had a quality that made your spine crawl, like hearing known words spoken by something that didn't understand their meaning. Command hadn't taken our reports seriously yet. Kyle's daily briefings mentioned the disturbances, but higher-ups attributed them to deployment stress and environmental factors. Standard military response to anything that didn't fit normal threat assessments. They'd probably keep dismissing our concerns until something actually happened, something concrete enough to require official action. Daniel's breathing had settled back to normal, but he continued watching the rocks where he'd seen movement. The kid had good instincts when he wasn't letting nerves get the better of him. If he thought he'd seen something, chances were decent that something had been there. "You think we're losing it?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the cold air between us. I'd been wondering the same thing for weeks, questioning whether months of isolation and stress were finally getting to our unit. Deployment could mess with your head in ways you didn't expect, make you see and hear things that weren't there. But 12 soldiers experiencing the same strange things seemed unlikely. "I think something's out there," I said. "I just don't know what." Daniel nodded, apparently satisfied with that answer. It was honest, at least. Whatever was making those sounds, whatever was moving through the mountains around our base, it was real enough that multiple trained observers were detecting it. Real enough that Kyle was taking it seriously. Real enough that we were all starting to dread the sunset. I moved to a better position and continued looking around the perimeter. The next few hours would crawl by like they always did, filled with phantom sounds and shadows that moved when they shouldn't. But we'd maintain our watch, report what we saw and heard, and try to keep each other steady until morning came and drove whatever was out there back into hiding. The laughter started again, closer this time, and Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle. 3 weeks had passed since that night in the tower, and the sounds hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd gotten worse. I checked my grip on my rifle and looked around the area through my night vision goggles. The green-tinted landscape stretched out in known patterns of rock and shadow, every boulder and dip remembered from countless patrols. Daniel moved beside me, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as we made our circuit around the wire. November in the Hindu Kush meant temperatures that dropped to near freezing after sunset, and tonight felt colder than usual. The kind of cold that made your gear feel heavier and your fingers get stiff around metal, even through gloves. I could see my breath in small puffs as we walked, and the exposed skin around my goggles had already gone numb. The base felt smaller at night, our area shrinking down to just the circle of light from our guard towers and the noise of generators. Beyond that, Afghanistan stretched away into darkness that seemed deeper and more complete than it had when we'd first arrived. 3 months of deployment had taught me that the mountains held sounds differently after dark, carrying voices and laughter from impossible distances. Daniel had drawn night watch duty with me again, and I could tell from his movements that the past few weeks hadn't been kind to him. He'd lost weight, his face looking sharper under the night vision equipment, and his hands shook slightly when he thought nobody was watching. The kid was holding it together during daylight hours, but something about the darkness had gotten under his skin. Kyle had started rotating watch assignments more frequently, making sure nobody spent too many back-to-back nights on area duty. Smart leadership, keeping the unit from burning out on the weird stuff. But it also meant we were all getting used to the pattern of sounds, learning to recognize the timing and locations where they seemed to start. Tonight felt different, though. The usual whispered conversations had started around midnight as expected, but they'd been quieter than normal, almost quiet. Like whatever was out there was waiting for something specific to happen. Daniel stopped walking and raised his hand for silence. I froze beside him, listening to the night sounds around our position. Wind through the rocks, distant generator noise, the occasional crackle of radio traffic from the command bunker. Then, I heard it too. A woman's voice, calling for help in clear English. The sound cut through the regular whispers like a knife, so distinct and out of place that it made my stomach drop. Female, definitely American, and close enough that we could make out actual words instead of the usual unclear murmuring. "Help me, please! Someone help me." Daniel's breathing quickened beside me, and I could see him looking around the darkness through his goggles, trying to pinpoint the source. The voice seemed to be coming from the northeast, somewhere in the cluster of boulders about 200 meters from our position. We'd patrolled that area dozens of times over the past 3 weeks, found nothing but rocks and empty ground. "Please, I need help. Is anyone there?" The desperation in her voice was clear, raw fear mixed with exhaustion and pain. It sounded like someone who'd been running, maybe injured, definitely in serious trouble. But the location made no sense. No civilians operated in this area, especially not at night, and American women definitely didn't wander the Afghan mountains alone. Daniel turned toward me, his eyes wide behind his goggles. "We have to check that out." I held up my hand, keeping my voice low. "Hold on. Think about this for a second." "Think about what?" "Someone needs help." The woman's voice called out again, closer this time, and I could hear what sounded like sobbing mixed with her pleas. Raw, human sounds that cut straight through any rational analysis of why this situation was impossible. Daniel took a step toward the sound, but I grabbed his arm. "No civilians should be out here, Danny, you know that. This area's been cleared for months. Maybe she escaped from somewhere. Maybe she's been hiding." "From what? There's nothing out here but rocks and Taliban who don't take American prisoners." The cries continued, growing more desperate and urgent. Whoever was out there sounded like they were in real pain, real terror, and every instinct I'd developed over years of military service said, you didn't ignore someone calling for help. But every survival instinct I'd learned in Afghanistan said this situation was wrong in ways that could get us killed. Daniel pulled away from my grip, his face set with determination. "We can't just leave her out there. Let me radio Kyle first." I keyed my mic and tried to raise the command bunker. "Base, this is Patrol 2. We have a situation on the northeast perimeter. Request guidance." Static answered me, the kind of electronic noise that meant either our equipment was malfunctioning or something was interfering with the signal. I tried again, adjusting the frequency and checking my battery level. "Base, Patrol 2. Do you copy?" More static, followed by what might have been voices, but too distorted to understand. The radio had been working fine an hour ago when we'd checked in, but now it was giving us nothing useful. The woman's voice called out again, and this time I could hear exhaustion creeping in alongside the fear, like someone who'd been running for a long time and was finally reaching the end of their strength. "Please, I can see your lights. Help me." Daniel looked at me with an expression I'd seen before, the same look he got when we'd found wounded civilians during our daytime patrols. The kid had a protective streak that ran deeper than his common sense, and I could tell he was about to move with or without permission. "We have to do something," he said. "If that's really someone who needs help and we just ignore them." He was right, and I knew it. Military training taught you to check for threats and follow procedures, but it also taught you that some situations required immediate action regardless of protocol. If there was even a chance that someone was out there injured and afraid, we couldn't just walk away. But every part of me was screaming that this was a trap. I checked my weapon and made sure my spare magazines were secure. "All right, but we do this smart. Stay close, watch the flanks, and if anything feels wrong, we fall back immediately." Daniel nodded, relief clear on his face. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." The woman's voice rose again, now mixed with what sounded like real sobbing. Human sounds that triggered every protective instinct while making my skin crawl with wrongness. I'd heard fear before, real terror from people in real danger, and this had all the right elements. But something about the timing, the location, the convenient English words felt staged. We moved toward the sound, weapons ready and night vision looking around for any signs of movement or additional threats. Behind us, forward operating base Shank continued its mechanical buzzing, generators and radios working normally while we walked away from safety into darkness that felt more hostile than it had minutes before. The woman's cries grew clearer as we approached the boulder field, and I could make out individual words now. She was calling for help, saying she was hurt, begging someone to find her. All the right things for someone in real distress, delivered with exactly the right amount of desperation and fear. Daniel moved faster as we got closer, his protective instincts overriding the caution that had kept us alive for 3 months. I stayed beside him, weapon ready, and eyes looking around the rocks for any sign of additional movement. Whatever was about to happen, we were committed now. The sobbing continued, guiding us deeper into the boulder field, toward a source we couldn't yet see. The woman's crying guided us deeper into the boulder field, each cry pulling Daniel forward faster than caution should have allowed. I kept my weapon ready and my eyes looking around the shadows between the rocks, every survival instinct I'd developed over 3 months screaming that this situation was wrong in fundamental ways. My night vision equipment painted the landscape in familiar green tones, transforming the harsh Afghan terrain into something that looked almost alien. Jagged rocks jutted up from the frozen ground like broken teeth, and the spaces between them created pockets of deeper darkness where anything could hide. We'd patrolled this area dozens of times during daylight hours, mapped every boulder and depression, but at night it felt like foreign territory. Daniel moved with purpose, his protective instincts overriding the caution that had kept us alive for months. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held his rifle ready but pointed down, prepared to help rather than fight. The kid's moral compass ran deeper than his training, and right now, It was pulling him towards someone who needed assistance, regardless of how impossible the situation seemed. The cries grew clearer as we navigated between two massive boulders that formed a natural corridor through the rock field. The sound bounced off stone surfaces, creating strange, bouncing sounds that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact source. But the desperation was unmistakable. Raw, human fear mixed with exhaustion, and what sounded like genuine physical pain. Then we found her. She was curled up in a small depression between two large rocks, completely naked and shivering violently in the freezing air. The sight hit me like a physical blow, so unexpected and wrong that my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. A woman, American from the sound of her earlier cries, alone and exposed in the Afghan mountains during the coldest part of the night. Her long, dark hair fell across her face and shoulders, partially concealing her features, but I could see enough to estimate she was in her 20s. Pale skin showed clearly through my night vision equipment, and she was curled into herself for warmth against the cold stone. Every visible inch of her body shook with violent tremors that looked painful and desperate. When she saw us approaching, her head snapped up and she cried out in what sounded like pure relief. "Thank God! Please help me." She reached toward us with both hands, her movements weak but urgent. The terror in her voice was clear, raw, and immediate, in a way that cut through any doubt about whether this situation was real. Daniel moved forward without hesitation, already taking off his jacket before I could stop him. Military training taught you to check for threats before helping, but seeing someone so obviously in need of help triggered every protective instinct the kid had. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle but loud enough to carry over the wind. "We're Americans. You're safe now." I stayed back a few steps, looking around the area around the depression for any signs of how she'd gotten here or what might have happened. The ground showed no obvious tracks leading to this spot, though the frozen earth and scattered rocks made it difficult to read sign even with proper equipment. The woman's position suggested she'd collapsed here rather than chosen this location deliberately. Daniel reached her and carefully wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, helping her sit up against the boulder behind her. She pulled the fabric tight around herself and looked up at him with an expression of gratitude mixed with lingering fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking almost as much as her body. "I thought I was going to die out here." I moved closer but kept my weapon ready, eyes continuing to look around our surroundings. The tactical part of my mind cataloged details automatically. No obvious wounds, no blood, no signs of restraints or recent violence. But finding an American woman naked in the Afghan mountains raised questions that demanded answers. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, crouching beside her while maintaining a respectful distance. "Sarah," she said, pulling his jacket tighter around herself. "I'm so cold. How long was I out here?" "We need to get you back to our base," Daniel said. "Can you walk?" Sarah nodded, though the movement looked unsteady. "I think so. I've been running for hours, maybe longer. I lost track of time." I stepped forward, keeping my voice calm but direct. "Sarah, how did you get here? What happened to you?" She looked up at me with eyes that showed the green glow of my night vision equipment. For a moment, her expression seemed to change, becoming more composed and alert than someone in her situation should be. But the change was so brief I might have imagined it. "They took me 3 days ago," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Local militants, I think. I was with a humanitarian aid group working in the villages east of here. They grabbed me during a supply run and brought me to some kind of camp in the mountains." The story sounded believable. Aid workers worked throughout the region, and kidnappings were a constant threat in Afghanistan. Local groups frequently targeted Western civilians for ransom or political leverage. But something about finding her here, in this specific location, bothered me in ways I couldn't put into words. "How did you escape?" I asked. Sarah's jaw tightened, and I could see her forcing herself to remember details that were obviously painful. They kept me tied up most of the time, but tonight the guard fell asleep. I managed to work free from the ropes and ran. I just kept running through the mountains until I couldn't go any further. Daniel helped her stand, and she leaned heavily against him for support. The contact seemed natural, a person seeking stability after trauma, but I noticed how quickly she'd turned toward him specifically, rather than either of us. Her movements looked unsteady, but there was something practiced about the way she positioned herself to appear vulnerable while maintaining physical contact with the person most likely to protect her. "Where were you being held?" I asked. "I'm not sure exactly. Somewhere higher up in the mountains, maybe 5 or 6 miles from here. It was dark when I ran, and I just followed the slope downward." The explanation made sense. Militants often used cave systems and hidden camps in the higher elevations, and a person running away on foot would naturally head downhill toward potential help. But 6 miles of rough terrain in darkness, naked and barefoot, seemed like an impossible distance for someone in her apparent condition. Daniel wrapped his arm around her waist to help support her weight, and Sarah leaned into him gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone would find me." We began making our way back through the boulder field toward the base. Sarah moved slowly but steadily, accepting Daniel's help while maintaining better balance than someone who'd supposedly been running through mountains for hours should have had. I walked point, looking ahead for threats, while my mind worked through the inconsistencies in her story. The base's lights were visible through the gaps between rocks, known reference points that guided us home through terrain that looked different in every direction at night. Our generators buzzed steadily in the distance, a mechanical sound that felt reassuring after the strange sounds of the boulder field. Throughout the return trip, I found myself watching Sarah as much as the surrounding area. Her breathing seemed controlled rather than labored, and she walked the rocky terrain with more confidence than fear. Most telling was how she never once looked back toward the area where we'd found her, never showed any concern about being followed or tracked by her supposed captors. Instead, she seemed to know exactly where we were going, her attention focused entirely on the lights of forward operating base Shank ahead of us, like someone who'd been watching our position long enough to understand its layout and defenses, rather than a desperate civilian who'd stumbled across salvation by accident. Daniel kept talking to her in low, reassuring tones, asking if she needed to rest or if anything hurt. Sarah responded appropriately, thanking him and expressing relief at being rescued. But there was something calculated about her gratitude that made my skin crawl. By the time we reached the perimeter wire, she was walking with minimal assistance and showed no signs of the exhaustion that should have accompanied her ordeal. Her story remained consistent, her manner appropriately grateful, and her need for help obviously genuine. But every instinct I'd developed over years of military service was telling me that something about Sarah was fundamentally wrong. The known shape of forward operating base Shank appeared from the darkness ahead of us, its guard towers and prefab structures outlined against the star-filled sky. Home looked smaller than usual after our trek through the boulder field, but the steady buzz of generators and the warm glow of interior lights felt like salvation after the strangeness of the past hour. Sarah moved steadily between Daniel and me, her borrowed jacket pulled tight around her shoulders as we approached the main gate. Kyle must have heard our approach because he came out from the command bunker before we reached the wire, James close behind him. Both men stopped dead when they saw Sarah, their expressions changing from routine alertness to complete shock in seconds. "What the hell?" Kyle's voice carried clearly across the small distance between us. James actually took a step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm before training kicked in, and he forced himself to relax. The kid had been jumpy for weeks, but seeing an American woman at our isolated outpost clearly hit him like a physical blow. "Found her in the rocks about 200 meters northeast," I called out as we passed through the gate. "Says she escaped from militants who've been holding her for 3 days. Kyle's leadership instincts took over immediately. He pointed toward the main shelter, his voice changing into the calm, professional tone he used during crisis situations. "Get her inside where it's warm. James, grab some water and whatever food we have ready, and find some clean clothes from the emergency supplies." Sarah looked up at Kyle with an expression of pure gratitude, her eyes wide and trusting. "Thank you. I can't believe I found you out here." "You're safe now," Kyle replied, though I could see him processing the tactical implications of her presence. An American civilian at our position meant radio calls to command, extraction protocols, and a mountain of paperwork that would take days to complete. James hurried ahead to prepare the shelter, and I could hear him moving around inside, gathering supplies and clearing space. The kid was efficient when he had specific tasks to focus on, and right now having something concrete to do probably helped him deal with the shock of our unexpected arrival. Daniel stayed close to Sarah as we entered the main shelter, his protective instincts on full display. He helped her sit down on one of our camp chairs and immediately started asking if she needed medical attention, if anything hurt, whether she was warm enough. The concern in his voice was real, but there was something else there too, an intensity that went beyond normal compassion for someone in distress. Sarah smiled at him with what looked like real appreciation. "I'm okay, really, just cold and tired. You probably saved my life out there." James returned with an armload of supplies, bottled water, an MRE, and a complete set of clean military fatigues from our emergency stock. He set everything down near Sarah's chair, but kept his distance, clearly uncertain how to interact with a civilian woman in our all-male environment. "Take your time," Kyle said. "There's a partition in the back corner where you can change privately. We'll give you space." While she changed behind the canvas partition James had set up, I pulled Kyle aside and gave him a quick briefing on the situation. I kept my voice low and stuck to the facts. Our patrol route, the location where we'd found her, and the basic details of her story about being held by militants. Daniel hung around nearby during my report, close enough to hear but mostly focused on the partition where Sarah was changing. His attention never moved from that corner of the shelter, and I could see him getting tense every time he heard fabric rustling or movement from behind the canvas. "Her story checks out?" Kyle asked quietly. "Details are consistent. Says she was grabbed during a humanitarian supply run, held in a camp somewhere in the higher elevations, managed to escape when her guard fell asleep." Kyle nodded, but I could see him running through the same tactical questions that had been bothering me. Aid workers don't usually operate this far out, especially not without security escorts. That's what I was thinking. Sarah emerged from behind the partition wearing the oversized military jacket and fatigues, both garments hanging loose on her frame but providing proper coverage and warmth. She looked significantly more composed than when we'd found her, her movements confident and her expression alert rather than traumatized. "Much better," she said, settling back into the chair and opening the water bottle James had provided. "Thank you all so much. I honestly thought I was going to die out there." She took a long drink, then opened the MRE and began eating with steady hands. No trembling, no hesitation, no signs of the shock that usually followed traumatic experiences. If anything, she seemed to be enjoying the military rations more than most civilians would. Kyle pulled up another chair and sat across from her, keeping professional distance while conducting what was basically a debriefing. "Sarah, can you tell us more about what happened? Any details that might help us understand the threat situation in this area?" She nodded, swallowing a bite of food before responding. "The group that took me was small, maybe 6 or 7 men. They spoke a dialect I didn't recognize, definitely local but not standard Pashto. Their camp was well hidden, built into some kind of cave system higher up in the mountains. The details sounded believable, exactly the kind of information someone in her situation would have noticed. But something about the way she delivered them bothered me. No hesitation, no emotional reaction when describing her captors, no difficulty recalling specifics that should have been traumatic to remember. "Did they hurt you?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with concern. Sarah looked directly at him, holding his look longer than the question required. "They roughed me up when they first grabbed me, but mostly they just kept me tied up. I think they were planning to move me somewhere else, maybe use me for ransom or prisoner exchange." Daniel's jaw tightened, and I could see anger building behind his protective instincts. The kid was taking her ordeal personally, investing himself emotionally in a way that could cloud his judgment if this situation turned dangerous. "How did you know to head in this direction after you escaped?" I asked. Sarah turned toward me with what looked like genuine appreciation. "I saw your lights from higher up in the mountains, just followed the glow and hoped I'd find help instead of more trouble." Another reasonable answer, delivered with the right amount of gratitude and relief. But her eye contact felt different when she looked at me compared to the others. With Daniel, her expression seemed warm and vulnerable. With Kyle and James, she appeared respectful and grateful. But when she looked at me, there was something calculating behind her eyes, like she was measuring my reaction to her responses. Kyle stood up and moved toward the radio equipment. "I'll need to contact command and arrange for extraction. They'll want to debrief you properly and get you medical attention." "Of course," Sarah agreed quickly, "though honestly, I feel fine. Just tired." "Standard procedure," Kyle explained. "We'll probably have a helicopter here first thing in the morning to pick you up." Sarah nodded, but something about her expression suggested the timeline didn't concern her at all. Most civilians rescued from hostile situations would be eager to leave as quickly as possible, anxious to get back to safety and medical care. Sarah seemed completely comfortable with spending the rest of the night at our isolated outpost. James had been quiet throughout the conversation, but now he cleared his throat nervously. "I can take watch duty if anyone needs to rest." I checked my watch. Nearly 0400 hours, with dawn still 2 hours away. The normal rotation would have Daniel and me finishing our patrol, but circumstances had obviously changed with Sarah's arrival. "I'll maintain watch," I said. "Everyone else should try to get some sleep before morning." Sarah looked up from her meal with an expression that seemed almost disappointed. "Actually, I'm not tired at all. Too much adrenaline, I think. Would it be okay if I stayed up? Maybe we could talk for a while." Her request sounded innocent enough, the kind of thing someone might want after a traumatic experience, human contact and conversation to help process what had happened. But something about the way she asked made my skin crawl, like she had specific reasons for wanting to stay awake that had nothing to do with trauma or adrenaline. Daniel immediately perked up at her suggestion. "I could stay up too. Keep you company." Sarah smiled at him with what looked like genuine warmth, and I watched Daniel's expression change into something that went well beyond protective concern. The kid was clearly attracted to her, drawn in by her vulnerability and gratitude in ways that were messing with his judgment. "That would be nice," Sarah said, her voice soft and inviting. "I'd like that very much." I settled back into my position by the radio equipment, watching the scene unfold across the shelter with growing worry. The conversation between Sarah and Daniel had started innocently enough, her asking questions about our deployment, him explaining the basics of our mission and the challenges of mountain patrols. But something about the dynamic was changing in ways that made my skin crawl. Sarah had moved twice in the past 30 minutes, each time ending up closer to Daniel's chair. What started as respectful distance had shrunk to less than an arm's length, and now she was leaning forward whenever she spoke, her body language becoming increasingly intimate. Her hand found reasons to touch his arm during conversation, brief contact when making a point, longer touches when laughing at his responses. The laughter was what bothered me most. Daniel wasn't particularly funny under normal circumstances, and military stories about patrol routes and supply shortages weren't exactly comedy material. But Sarah found everything he said hilarious, throwing her head back with exaggerated delight at observations that barely qualified as mildly amusing. The sound felt wrong, too theatrical and calculated, like someone performing happiness rather than feeling it. Kyle sat across the shelter cleaning his rifle, maintaining the appearance of routine maintenance while keeping one eye on our unexpected guest. James had found busy work organizing supply containers, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unsure how to handle the presence of a civilian woman in our all-male environment. Both men were trying to give Sarah and Daniel space to talk while staying close enough to maintain security protocols. Daniel seemed completely oblivious to anything except Sarah's attention. His posture had changed from the exhausted slouch he'd carried for weeks into something more animated and confident. The kid was practically glowing under her focus, responding to her questions with enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him since our deployment began. Every time she touched his arm or laughed at something he said, his expression brightened like someone had turned up a dimmer switch. The radio crackled occasionally with routine traffic from other outposts, normal chatter that helped maintain the illusion everything was proceeding according to standard procedures. But the atmosphere in the shelter felt charged with something that had nothing to do with rescued civilians or humanitarian crises. Sarah's presence had introduced an element that didn't belong in our controlled environment, something that was changing the fundamental dynamics between my teammates. Around 0400 hours, Sarah stood up from her chair with fluid grace and began tugging at the military jacket she'd been wearing. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she worked the fabric away from her shoulders, claiming the shelter had become too warm for the heavy outer layer. "It's so much warmer in here than I expected," she said, letting the jacket slide down her arms. "You guys have really good heating systems." The temperature outside was still near freezing, and our heating barely managed to keep the interior comfortable enough to prevent hypothermia during extended stays. Nobody in their right mind would consider the shelter too warm, especially someone who'd supposedly spent hours running through mountain terrain in freezing conditions. Daniel's attention focused completely on her movements as she folded the jacket and set it aside. His eyes tracked every motion with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable, like he was seeing something the rest of us were missing. Kyle looked up from his rifle maintenance, then deliberately looked away when he realized what was happening. James stopped organizing supplies entirely, pretending to study inventory sheets while stealing glances toward the center of the shelter. Sarah seemed completely aware of the effect she was having. Her movements became even more deliberate as she adjusted the oversized military shirt underneath, rolling up sleeves that hung well past her wrists and smoothing fabric that hung loose around her body. Nothing about her actions was explicitly inappropriate, but everything felt calculated to draw attention in ways that normal people didn't behave after traumatic experiences. When she caught me watching her with obvious suspicion, her expression changed into something that looked almost amused. She held my look directly, her lips curving into a smile that seemed to mock my concerns and challenge me to voice the objections I was thinking but couldn't articulate. The look lasted just long enough to make me certain she knew exactly what I was thinking, then disappeared so quickly I almost wondered if I'd imagined it. Daniel moved his chair closer to hers, closing the remaining distance between them until their knees were almost touching. Sarah settled back down with obvious satisfaction, immediately resuming the conversation as if nothing had changed. But her body language became even more intimate, leaning closer when she spoke and maintaining physical contact that went well beyond casual interaction. She whispered something in Daniel's ear that made him blush visibly even in the shelter's dim lighting. Whatever she said caused him to nod eagerly, his expression changing into something that looked almost desperate. The kid was completely under her influence, hanging on every word and responding to her suggestions with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. I couldn't take it anymore. Something about this entire situation was fundamentally wrong, and Daniel was too captivated to recognize the danger he was walking into. I stood up from my position by the radio and approached their corner of the shelter, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. "Daniel, we should probably maintain some distance. Protocol for civilian interactions." Daniel turned toward me with irritation I'd never seen from him before, his expression shifting from grateful infatuation to actual anger in the space of a heartbeat. "Back off, Mike. She's been through enough without us treating her like a threat." The response hit me like cold water. Daniel had never spoken to me with that tone, never dismissed my concerns so completely. Something about Sarah's presence was changing him in real time, turning his natural protective instincts into something possessive and irrational. Sarah continued her slow process of undressing, working the military shirt's buttons with movements that seemed designed to hold attention rather than simply adjust clothing. She kept looking at me throughout, her expression challenging and almost predatory. The mockery in her smile became more obvious as she watched me struggle with how to respond to behavior that was inappropriate but not explicitly threatening. Daniel moved his attention back to her immediately, dismissing my presence entirely as she continued whatever private conversation they'd been having. The kid was completely lost to her influence, and I realized with growing dread that whatever was happening here was just beginning. I couldn't watch this manipulation continue any longer. Daniel was completely under her influence, and whatever game Sarah was playing had gone far enough. I stepped forward from my position by the radio equipment, moving toward their corner with clear purpose. "Daniel, that's enough. Step away from her." My voice carried more authority than I'd intended, the tone I used when situations required immediate compliance rather than discussion. Daniel's head snapped toward me with an expression I'd never seen before, pure hostility mixed with something that looked almost protective rage. "I told you to back off, Mike. Leave us alone." The anger in his response made Kyle look up from his rifle maintenance, his hands slowing on the cleaning cloth as he noticed the tension building across the shelter. James stopped pretending to organize supplies and turned toward us, clearly sensing the change in atmosphere, but uncertain how to respond. I took another step closer, ignoring Daniel's warning. "Something's wrong here. You need to..." "He needs to what?" Sarah's voice cut through my words like a blade, sweet and mocking at the same time. She placed her hand flat against Daniel's chest, her fingers spreading across the fabric of his shirt with possessive intimacy. Daniel's expression changed instantly. The anger left his face, replaced by something vacant and distant. His eyes lost focus, pupils getting bigger until they looked almost black in the shelter's dim lighting. The change happened in seconds, like someone had switched off a circuit in his brain. Sarah leaned close to his ear and whispered something I couldn't hear. Her lips barely moved, but whatever she said made Daniel's entire body go stiff. He stared straight ahead without blinking, his breathing shallow and mechanical. That's when I noticed her skin starting to change. The healthy pink tone faded to an ugly grayish color that spread from her hands up her arms like some kind of infection. Her fingernails, which had been normal just moments before, began getting longer into sharp points that looked more like claws than anything human. The changes happened slowly enough that I could track each horrifying detail, but too quickly for me to process what I was actually seeing. Kyle's rifle hit the floor as he scrambled for his service weapon. James spun around completely, his eyes wide with terror as he reached for the pistol on his belt. Both men moved with military precision, but their actions felt sluggish compared to the speed of Sarah's change. Her eyes began to glow. Not a figure of speech, not tricks of light or reflection from our equipment. Actual red light came from her pupils, creating crimson shadows across Daniel's face as she continued whispering in his ear. The light grew brighter with each passing second, turning her entire expression into something from a nightmare. Sarah's head turned toward me while her hand stayed pressed against Daniel's chest. Her smile showed teeth that had become pointed and razor-sharp, designed for tearing rather than chewing. When she spoke, her voice carried the same sweet tone she'd used throughout the evening, creating a horrifying contrast with her monstrous appearance. "You were right to be suspicious, Michael. Too bad you waited so long to act on those instincts." Before I could move or speak, she grabbed Daniel by the throat with inhuman strength. Her claws went through his skin easily, and I heard the wet sound of flesh tearing as her fingers tightened around his neck. Daniel's vacant expression broke as pain cut through whatever trance she'd put him in. He tried to scream. Sarah's other hand struck like lightning, claws extended, ripping into his chest before any sound could escape his throat. The fabric of his shirt disappeared under her attack, shredded along with the skin and muscle underneath. Blood erupted across the shelter walls in sprays, painting the canvas and supply containers with red that looked black in the glow from her eyes. The sound was worse than anything I'd heard in 3 months of combat. Wet tearing noises mixed with Daniel's choked attempts to breathe, creating a symphony of violence that made my stomach lurch. Sarah moved with brutal efficiency, her claws working through his torso like she was gutting a deer, opening him from throat to stomach in movements too fast to follow. Her face twisted during the attack, human features stretching and reshaping into something that belonged in hell rather than our shelter. The bone structure seemed to change beneath her skin, creating angles that hurt to look at directly. Only her voice remained recognizably Sarah's, making a soft noise as she worked. Kyle's rifle fired behind me, the report deafening in the enclosed space. I saw the muzzle flash light up the shelter walls, but the bullets passed through Sarah without any visible effect. No impact, no blood, no reaction at all. She continued her work as if nothing had happened. Daniel's body went limp in her grip, but she kept tearing at him with methodical precision. Blood pooled on the floor beneath them, spreading outward in a growing circle that reached my boots. The metallic smell filled the air, mixing with something else that reminded me of sulfur and decay. Sarah looked up from Daniel's body with that same terrible smile, her fangs dripping with his blood, her glowing red eyes fixed on Kyle first, then James, then settled on me with obvious satisfaction. "Poor Daniel," she said, her voice carrying mock sympathy. He was so eager to be helpful, so trusting. James broke first. He bolted toward the shelter's exit, moving with desperate speed toward the canvas flap that led outside. Sarah moved faster than physics should have allowed, appearing in his path before he'd taken 3 steps. One moment she was crouched over Daniel's remains, the next she was blocking the doorway with her arms spread wide. James stumbled backward, his face white with terror as he raised his pistol with shaking hands. Sarah tilted her head like she was studying an interesting insect, completely unconcerned by the weapon pointed at her chest. I stood frozen in the center of the shelter, my own sidearm still holstered, my training completely useless against something that went against every rule of engagement I'd ever learned. Daniel's blood continued spreading across the floor, reaching the edges of my boots while his killer smiled at me with genuine amusement. Sarah's red eyes locked onto mine, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same intimate tone she'd used to seduce Daniel. "Your turn, Michael. Do you want to play?" I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body had locked up the moment Sarah asked if I wanted to play, her voice carrying that same sweet mockery while Daniel's blood continued spreading across the shelter floor. The red light from her eyes painted everything in hellish light, making the familiar walls of our shelter look like the inside of some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The creature that had been Sarah began to change again. Her monstrous features softened, the gray color fading from her skin as her claws pulled back into normal fingernails. Within seconds, she looked human again, the same vulnerable woman Daniel had found in the rocks just hours earlier. Even the military fatigues she wore appeared clean, free of the blood that should have covered them after what she'd done to him. "You were so smart to distrust me, Michael." Her voice carried genuine admiration now, like she was praising a student who'd solved a difficult problem. "I could feel your suspicion from the moment Daniel brought me back. It was delicious." I watched her pace around Daniel's mutilated corpse, stepping through his blood without leaving footprints. The liquid seemed to part around her feet like she existed in a different space than the rest of us. Her movements were graceful, predatory, completely at odds with the horror she'd just committed. Behind me, I heard muffled sounds from the communications corner, Kyle and James moving equipment, probably trying to barricade themselves behind radio gear and supply containers. Smart thinking, but it felt pointless. If this thing could appear and disappear the way it had with James, Walls wouldn't stop it. Such a shame you waited so long to act on those beautiful instincts, the creature continued, its form shifting again. This time the transformation was more subtle. Sarah's features remained, but her expression became predatory in ways that no human face should be able to achieve. Daniel might still be alive if you'd spoken up sooner. The words hit like physical blows. I'd known something was wrong from the moment we found her. Every military instinct I'd developed over years of service had screamed warnings, but I'd let Daniel's excitement override my judgment. The kid was dead because I'd second-guessed myself. As if reading my thoughts, the creature's smile widened. "Oh yes, Michael. This is absolutely your fault. You saw through my performance, but you were too weak to stop it. Too worried about protocols and team unity to save your friend's life." The voice changed mid-sentence, moving from Sarah's seductive tone to something else entirely. Daniel's voice came from her throat, perfect in every detail I remembered. "Why didn't you help me, Mike? You knew she was dangerous. Why didn't you save me?" The sound of Daniel speaking through that thing's mouth made my stomach turn. I'd heard him use that exact pleading tone during our first weeks of deployment, when he was struggling with homesickness and looking for reassurance. The creature had captured not just his voice, but the emotional undertones that made it recognizably him. "You promised my mom you'd look out for me," it continued in Daniel's voice, each word a knife twist. "You told her I'd come home safe." I had made that promise. Daniel's mother had cornered me at the deployment send-off, tears in her eyes as she begged me to watch over her youngest son. I'd given her my word without hesitation, confident in my ability to keep him alive through whatever Afghanistan threw at us. The creature laughed, the sound changing between Sarah's musical tone and Daniel's nervous chuckle. "Such sweet guilt, Michael. I can practically taste it from here." The voice changed again, becoming something that sounded like grinding metal mixed with static from a broken radio. When it spoke now, the words felt wrong in ways that made my ears hurt. "We have been hunting your unit for weeks, soldier. Every scream, every whisper, every laugh in the darkness. That was us, feeding on your fear, building toward this moment." The thing that looked like Sarah circled around me, always staying just outside arm's reach. I turned slowly to keep it in sight, my hand itching to reach for my sidearm, but knowing any sudden movement might trigger another attack. The terror you felt during those long nights was so nourishing. It continued in that metallic voice. 4 frightened soldiers, jumping at shadows, losing sleep, wondering if they were going insane. We could have taken any of you at any time, but the fear was too delicious to waste. From the communications corner, I heard Kyle's voice trying to raise command on the radio, his words too quiet for me to make out. The creature heard him too, its head turning toward the sound with mild interest before dismissing the threat entirely. "Your friends are welcome to call for help," it said, Sarah's appearance returning as its voice shifted back to her seductive tone. "No one will believe what happened here tonight. They'll blame enemy action, equipment failure, anything except the truth." The creature stepped closer, close enough that I could see details that made my skin crawl. Her eyes looked normal from a distance, but up close I could see the red glow still burning behind her pupils like embers. Her smile showed teeth that changed between human and predatory, depending on the angle. "Daniel's death was particularly satisfying," she said, crouching down to run her fingers through the blood pool beside his body. Such earnest desire to help, such genuine compassion. He never suspected until the very end, when my claws were already in his throat. The casual way she described his murder made rage burn through my chest, cutting through the paralysis that had held me frozen. Daniel had died because he'd tried to help someone who needed rescue. His best qualities had been used against him by something that fed on human decency. "You see, Michael, your kind are so predictable," the creature continued, standing up and beginning to circle me again. "Show them a vulnerable female, trigger their protective instincts, and they'll walk into any trap. Daniel practically begged to be my victim. I slowly moved my hand toward my sidearm, keeping the motion casual and deliberate. The creature was focused on its monologue, describing the hunt in detail, and I hoped it would continue talking long enough for me to draw my weapon. The sounds we made each night were perfectly calibrated, it said, its voice shifting to that grinding metal tone again. Enough human qualities to trigger your rescue instincts, enough strangeness to keep you afraid. We studied your responses, learned your weaknesses, planned the perfect approach. My fingers found the grip of my pistol. It felt good to have something after hours of being helpless, but I remembered Kyle's rifle having no effect on this thing. Still, the creature had reacted to my earlier movements like it was worried about physical threats, and it had chosen to toy with me rather than simply killing me outright. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination, the creature continued, moving closer as it spoke. Take one of you to build trust, then eliminate the others at our leisure. Daniel was meant to be first of many, not the only meal. Sarah's body began changing again, her features becoming more sharp and dangerous. The red glow in her eyes got brighter. Whatever was about to happen, the talking phase was ending. But you've been such an entertaining audience, Michael. Your guilt, your rage, your helplessness. It's been almost as satisfying as Daniel's blood. The creature moved toward me with smooth grace, no longer pretending to move like a human. I could see its muscles tightening beneath Sarah's skin, getting ready for another attack. This was my chance. When it jumped forward, claws coming out from fingertips that had looked normal seconds before, I drew my sidearm and fired 3 rounds center mass as fast as I could pull the trigger. The gunshots were deafening in the enclosed space, but I heard something else underneath the shots. A shriek that sounded like metal tearing combined with an animal in agony. The creature stumbled backward, black blood spraying from wounds in its chest where my bullets had found their mark. Unlike Kyle's rifle rounds that had passed through it without effect, my pistol shots had clearly done damage. The thing that looked like Sarah grabbed at its chest, black liquid pouring between its fingers and pooling on the floor next to Daniel's red blood. Its perfect human appearance cracked like a broken mask, revealing glimpses of something underneath that hurt to look at directly. "Impossible," it snarled, its voice becoming that grinding metal sound again. "You cannot harm us with your primitive weapons." But the evidence went against its words. The creature was bleeding, wounded, backing away from me toward the shelter wall with movements that looked unsteady rather than graceful. Whatever it was, it could be hurt by the right kind of force applied at the right moment. It fixed me with a look full of pure hatred, its eyes blazing bright enough to light up the entire shelter. When it spoke again, its voice carried promise of future payback. "This is not finished, soldier. We know where to find you." The creature threw itself backward with inhuman strength, crashing through the canvas wall of our shelter like it was tissue paper. I heard the sound of metal supports snapping and fabric tearing, followed by heavy footsteps retreating into the pre-dawn darkness outside our perimeter. The shelter fell silent except for the buzz of our generator and the distant sound of Kyle's radio chatter from the communications corner. I stood in the center of the space, my pistol still raised toward the hole in our wall, breathing hard and trying to process what had just happened. Daniel's body lay at my feet, his blood mixing with the black substance the creature had left behind. The kid who'd been so eager to help someone in distress was gone, killed by the very compassion that had made him a good soldier and better person. Behind me, I heard movement as Kyle and James came out from their improvised barricade, their footsteps careful and hesitant as they approached the scene. But I couldn't turn around yet. I kept my weapon trained on the torn wall, watching for any sign of the creature's return, knowing that whatever had just happened was only the beginning of something much worse. I couldn't lower my weapon for the longest time after that thing went through our torn shelter wall. My hands stayed locked around the grip, finger ready on the trigger, watching that ragged hole for any sign of movement. Kyle and James came out from their makeshift barricade behind the radio equipment, but I barely noticed them coming. Every shadow outside looked wrong. Every sound of wind through the rocks made me tense for another attack. The adrenaline wouldn't let me move from that spot where I'd made my stand. Daniel's blood had stopped spreading across the floor, forming a dark pool that bounced our emergency lighting in ways that made my stomach turn. The kid's body lay twisted where the creature had dropped him, his chest torn open in wounds no human weapon could have made. His face was turned toward me, eyes wide and glassy, still holding that expression of confused terror from his final moments. Kyle's voice seemed to come from far away as he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. Mike, what the hell was that thing? I couldn't answer him. How do you explain something that shouldn't exist to someone who watched it happen but still couldn't believe it? Kyle had seen the creature transform, watched bullets pass through it, saw the impossible speed and strength, but his mind was already trying to make the experience into something manageable. Some kind of chemical weapon, maybe? Kyle continued, speaking more to himself than to me. Hallucinogenic gas that made us see things, could explain the sounds we've been hearing, the paranoia. James sat heavily on a supply crate near the communications corner, his face pale and sweaty. He'd drawn his sidearm but held it pointed at the floor, his hand shaking so badly I could see the barrel wobbling from across the shelter. Every few seconds he looked toward Daniel's body, then quickly looked away before the sight could register fully. I finally managed to lower my weapon when the first hints of gray light began coming through the hole in our wall. The darkness outside was giving way to dawn, and something about approaching sunrise made the creature's return feel less likely. Whatever that thing was, it had worked in shadow and fear. Daylight wouldn't make it less dangerous, but it might change how we dealt with it. Kyle moved to the radio equipment with purpose that came from training rather than confidence. His voice cracked slightly as he keyed the microphone, trying to reach command for immediate extraction and medical support. I listened to him struggle with the words, trying to explain why we needed emergency evacuation without describing what had actually happened. Base, this is Outpost 7, requesting immediate extraction and medical support. We have 1 KIA and need emergency evacuation for 3 personnel. The response came back through static. Outpost 7, what is the nature of your emergency? Please provide tactical situation and threat assessment. Kyle looked at me, then at James, then at Daniel's torn-up remains. His mouth opened and closed several times before he found words that wouldn't get our entire unit flagged for psychiatric evaluation. Base, we experienced enemy contact resulting in 1 fatality. Request immediate extraction due to compromised position and wounded personnel. I knew he was lying by omission, but what choice did he have? The truth would sound like combat stress or shared hallucination. Command would want medical evaluation, psychological assessment, and detailed investigation that would raise questions we couldn't answer. Kyle was protecting what was left of our unit the only way he could. James got up and stumbled toward the shelter's rear corner, making retching sounds that meant he was about to be sick again. I'd watched him throw up twice already since the creature ran away, his body rejecting the reality of what we'd experienced. The sounds of his dry heaving mixed with Kyle's radio chatter, creating a mess of noise that felt almost as wrong as the creature's laughter had. I went to my equipment bag and grabbed my cleaning kit, needing something practical to focus on while my mind processed the night's events. My sidearm had proven effective against the creature when Kyle's rifle hadn't, and I wanted to understand why. The barrel showed residue from 3 rounds fired at close range, normal wear patterns that told me nothing about why my bullets had wounded something that should have been invulnerable. I cleaned each component methodically, working by touch more than sight as my eyes kept drifting to Daniel's body or the torn wall where our sanctuary had been violated. Kyle finished his radio conversation and went toward the shelter's damaged exterior wall, stepping carefully around the blood pools. I watched him examine the ragged edges where the creature had torn through canvas and metal supports like they were cardboard. His expression changed from confusion to something approaching professional curiosity as he crouched down outside our perimeter. "Mike, you need to see this," he called, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. I finished putting my pistol back together and loaded a fresh magazine before joining him in the cold dawn air. The temperature hit like a punch after hours in our heated shelter, but the shock helped clear my head enough to focus on what Kyle had found. Strange markings pressed into the frozen sand showed where the creature had landed after crashing through our wall. The impressions looked like footprints at first, but the shape was all wrong. Too long, with marks that suggested claws rather than toes, and a size that showed something much larger than Sarah's human body had appeared to be. "These don't match any animal tracks I've seen in 3 months of patrols," Kyle said, his voice quiet with the kind of controlled fear that comes from accepting dangerous reality. "Look at the depth. Whatever made these had to weigh twice what she appeared to." I knelt beside the markings, noting how they continued away from our shelter in a straight line toward the rocky area where we'd first found Sarah. The creature hadn't run away randomly. It had gone back along a planned route, moving with purpose rather than panic, even with its wounds. More disturbing were the other tracks Kyle had found scattered around our area. Older impressions, partially filled with wind-blown sand, suggested the creature had been circling our position for days or weeks. The pattern showed careful watching, studying our routines and defenses while we'd dismissed the sounds as environmental factors or deployment stress. "It's been watching us," I said, the words feeling heavy in the morning air. All those sounds, the whispers, the laughter, it was mapping our responses, learning our weaknesses. Kyle nodded, standing up and brushing sand from his knees. "Makes me wonder about other outposts in the region. Those reports we've been hearing about soldiers going missing, units finding personnel torn apart with no evidence of enemy contact." The thought hit me like ice water. We weren't the first target, just the most recent. Somewhere in these mountains, other creatures might be hunting isolated military positions, using the same tactics that had nearly destroyed our unit. The official reports would continue blaming enemy action or equipment failure, because the truth was too impossible for anyone to accept. Command would file Daniel's death under hostile contact, another casualty of asymmetric warfare in difficult terrain. The torn shelter would be blamed on explosive devices or small arms fire. The psychological trauma affecting James would be labeled combat stress, treatable with medication and counseling. Everything would fit into categories that made sense on paper, but I would know the truth. Every night watch for the rest of my military career would carry the memory of red eyes and impossible speed, claws that could tear through human flesh like paper, and the sound of Daniel's voice coming from something that had killed him. James had come back outside, his face still pale, but his shaking under better control. He stood slightly apart from Kyle and me, his eyes checking the surrounding rocks with the constant alertness of someone who would never feel safe in open terrain again. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat tone of shock wearing off into acceptance. "How many others do you think are out there?" Kyle and I looked at each other. The question hung in the morning air like smoke, with no answer but impossible to ignore. If creatures like this were hunting military positions across Afghanistan, how many soldiers had died without anyone understanding the real threat? How many families had gotten notifications about enemy action when the truth was something much worse? The sound of rotor blades cut through our thoughts, getting louder as the helicopter came from the southeast. Kyle had managed to speed up our evacuation request, probably by stressing the security problem at our position. Within minutes, we'd be loading Daniel's body and leaving this place behind. But leaving didn't mean forgetting. The creature had made sure of that. I took one last look at the mountains around our position as the helicopter touched down, its rotor wash scattering sand across the strange footprints and filling the air with grit. Somewhere in those rocky peaks, something was watching our departure, planning its next hunt, choosing its next victims from isolated outposts scattered across the Afghan countryside. The medics worked efficiently to load Daniel's body into a black bag, their movements professional and respectful. They didn't ask questions about the wounds. Field personnel learned not to examine casualties too closely when the answers might be worse than ignorance. The official cause of death would be determined later, in clean facilities by people who hadn't seen impossible things. As we lifted off and gained altitude, I pressed my face to the window and watched forward operating base Shank shrink below us. The torn shelter looked like a small scar on the landscape, barely visible against the huge expanse of rocks and sand. In a few days, another unit would occupy the position, and the cycle would begin again. The strange sounds that had bothered us for weeks had finally shown their source, but knowledge brought no comfort. I knew I would never feel safe on night watch again, regardless of where the military stationed me next. The creature was still out there, wounded but not dead, carrying grudges and hunting new prey. And somewhere in the darkness, Daniel's voice would continue calling for help that would never come.